What is the most mysterious or paranormal thing you've personally witnessed? Back in 2007, my grandpa finally lost his 20-year battle with leukemia. My grandma struggled afterward, being alone in the house they had lived in for almost 60 years. A few months later, we moved her into an assisted living residence. For insurance reasons, since the house would otherwise be vacant, my parents asked if I wanted to move in so I could keep an eye on it and finally move out of their place. I said absolutely. Not long after he passed, strange things started happening. The portrait of him in the living room fell off its hook. Picture frames with photos of him flipped face down during the night. I didn't think much of it at the time, though, because I assumed my grandma was imagining things. Before I moved in, my family rented a large dumpster so we could clear out some of the clutter. Since we spent most of the day cleaning, and it was summer, we brought the family dog with us. My grandpa had loved that dog dearly. After he passed, though, she refused to go down into the basement, where he had spent most of his time in his office. She would not go down there at all, and barked at the stairway a few times. That was strange, because our dog almost never barked. It was the first time I really thought, he's here. I moved in shortly after. While I lived there, things went missing all the time. I bought a new lock set to change the back door lock, brought it home, and put it in a cupboard to deal with over the weekend. A few days later, I went to install it, and it was gone. After a week of searching, I finally found it in the trunk of my uncle's old BMW 2002, which he stored in the garage. I only found it because I happened to be looking at the car. My grandpa was always a prankster, so I almost came to expect things like that. He used to wake up at 5:30 every morning to listen to the early news on the radio in the kitchen. Some mornings I'd wake up and the radio would already be on. I often heard the sound of typing coming from his office in the basement. It became comforting. I found myself talking to my grandpa out loud, even having conversations with him. I missed him. After about 6 months, though, it all stopped. I wasn't hearing anything anymore. Nothing went missing. The radio no longer turned on at 5:30. I shrugged it off for a few days, but it started to worry me. I went back to my parents' place, picked up the dog, and brought her with me. She was hesitant at first, but she went into the house. There was one thing that stood out, though. Every time she had been there since my grandpa died, she had refused to go downstairs. This time, she did. She went straight down to his office. Nothing about the room was different, but she wasn't barking. She wasn't pacing. She wasn't doing anything at all. That was when I realized he was gone. I broke down. Suddenly, I felt incredibly alone. Even though it had been about 8 months since he died, it was the first time it truly felt like he was final. For anyone who thinks I made this up, there's no real way for me to prove otherwise. Whether you believe me or not doesn't matter to me. If you knew me personally, you'd know I'm one of the least imaginative creative writers I know. I honestly couldn't make something like this up. Story 2. The scariest moment of my life happened while a friend and I were camping in eastern Canada as teenagers. We decided to sleep in an abandoned camper we found deep in a large forest near our town. It had been there so long that small trees had grown up around it. We had stumbled across it a few months earlier while exploring and thought it would be cool and brave to sleep there for one night. So, one weekend, we did. We arrived after dark because we got lost trying to find the camper. We only had a very low-power flashlight, which made it even harder. When we finally found it, we opened the rusty door and stepped inside. The sounds in the camper were shrill and echoing. Typical camper items were strewn about: cups, empty cans, and swollen Pulp Fiction novels. Already exhausted, we settled into one end of the camper where the bed area had originally been before the cushions had rotted down to almost nothing. A long hallway stretched the length of the camper, so we could see nearly from one end to the other. It was a miserable night. Several rats were living in there. I saw them staring at us from a chewed-out section of the ceiling. When the wind blew, the outside of the camper would shriek and groan. At one point, we even thought we heard a bear walking around outside. Still, we feigned bravery and acted like we were having a good time, but we were on edge. At some point, I woke from an uncomfortable sleep. I sat up to adjust myself when I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye. At the other end of the camper, there was a small window. When I looked toward it, I saw the silhouette of a man. He was clearly standing outside, staring straight at me. At first, I thought it might just be the strange shape of a tree or something, but when I shifted slightly to get a better look, the figure clearly reacted and then froze. My heart was pounding. I woke my friend immediately, whispering, "Someone is here," over and over, without taking my eyes off the man's profile. He woke up instantly, and I nodded toward the window. He saw him too. We whispered frantically about who it could be, and why he was staring at us. For the next 10 minutes, no joke, we stared him down. The longer it went on, the more frightened we became. Occasionally he would move, but he always kept his eyes locked on us. Eventually I shouted, "Hey!" No reaction. My friend was braver than I was and decided to shine the flashlight at him. The moment he did, we realized our horrible mistake. It was not a window on the other side of the camper at all. It was a mirror. We had been staring at ourselves from the very start. Completely idiotic. Still, it was the most terrifying, relieving, and funny moment of my life, and I will never forget it. It was the closest thing to a paranormal experience I have ever had. Story 3. I was living in an apartment with 3 roommates at the time. I worked all sorts of weird hours and stayed up late most nights. Our apartment had 2 hallways that formed a capital L. My room was at the top of the L, and the bathroom was at the corner where the 2 lines met, with the door on the inside middle of the shorter section. The living room was in the outside corner. I walked out of my room to go to the bathroom, with no need to turn on the light, as it was a path I had taken hundreds of times before. As I left the bathroom, I turned to head back to my room. Just as I switched off the bathroom light, I saw her standing where the short hallway met the living room. A teenage girl, wearing a white flowery dress, just standing there, smiling. She did not look evil, just like a normal person smiling at me. I completely freaked out and ran straight to my room. About 20 minutes later, I finally came back out, turning on all the lights as I moved through the apartment. She was nowhere to be seen. However, the spot where I had seen her standing was noticeably colder than the rest of the apartment, especially for an August evening. Creepy, but not the worst part. I lived there for about another year and never saw her again. After I moved out, I was hanging out with one of my roommates, the one who had the bedroom at the end of the short hallway, right next to the bathroom. We were talking, and I mentioned that I had never felt comfortable in the apartment after something that happened there. He replied, "Oh, you saw her too." I nearly drove off the road when he said that. We then both described her, finishing each other's sentences as we did. He had seen her twice. I was indifferent about ghosts before that. Now I believe in them, or at least believe in something. It was deeply unsettling, and every time I tell the story, the hair still stands up on my arms. Story 4. Not me, but my dad. When he was younger, he used to see a woman in a white nightdress holding a candelabra walking along the hallway at his old house. No one ever believed him, but he thought it was his grandmother. Fast forward 20 plus years, and he's talking to someone he works with. This girl says she used to see a woman in a white nightdress holding a candelabra in her old house. My dad asks where she used to live, and it was his old house. Spooky. Story 5. I saw a shadow person once. I did not know that was what it was called until much later. At the time, I was living in a house in Laguna Beach that had been there since the 1920s. Over the years, it had been a speakeasy, a place for S-workers, and even a house used for smuggling illegal immigrants. One day, my new wife and I were having an argument. I cannot even remember what it was about. She walked down the block to get a cup of coffee and cool off, leaving me alone in the house. The layout of the place was incredibly haphazard. On one side, there was a bedroom and a living room, then a bathroom with 2 entrances. On the other side of the bathroom was a hallway with windows along one wall and 2 bedrooms along the other. From my bedroom, I could see across the hall into the bathroom, through it, and down the other hallway. I was standing at my dresser when I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye and looked up. There was something there, and honestly, this still gives me goosebumps even now, 17 years later. It was a black figure, maybe about 3 feet tall, only vaguely humanoid. It looked like black scribbles forming a human shape, but the scribbles were moving, almost like electricity arcing. That is the best way I can describe it. There was no sound that I can remember. When I first saw it, I was not afraid, just confused, thinking, what the hell is that? Then it noticed me looking at it. I cannot say it turned around exactly, it just seemed to focus on me. That was when I became scared. I did not move or scream. I was completely frozen as it suddenly rushed down the hallway toward me. I have no idea what it intended to do, but the moment it entered the bathroom, the door closest to me slammed shut. That is when I screamed and called for my wife, forgetting that she was not home. I went outside into the daylight and did not go back in until she returned about 10 minutes later. I do not believe in ghosts, and I do not think I saw something supernatural, but I know I saw something. I still do not know what it was. Edit. I am not giving out personal information since I have not lived there in almost 20 years. But if you are ever in Laguna, look for the blue, rundown apartments down the street from Whole Foods and Cafe Zinc. The ones with the ivy-covered gate. Also, my wife later reminded me that I did not actually run outside. She found me still standing at the dresser, wearing a shirt, but no pants. Story 6. I grew up in the Arctic. In the town where I lived, as long as the night was clear, it was completely normal to see all kinds of strange lights moving across the sky. Winter in the Arctic is long, which means spending a lot of time under the stars. It's beautiful, as long as you don't mind the cold. Sometimes I would ride a snowmobile a few kilometers out of town, shut it off, and lie down in the snow, looking up at it all, with only the occasional breeze breaking the silence. The northern lights were common there too. They didn't happen every day, but often enough that people eventually stopped paying much attention, as long as they weren't especially spectacular. On one particular night, without asking my parents, it was their snowmobile, I decided to go on one of my midnight drives out of town. I drove a few kilometers over the hills to find a spot devoid of light pollution from town, shut off the machine, and settled in to look up and be reflective. It was not all that interesting at first. A few satellites passed here and there, some relatively boring activity affecting the magnetic field, nothing unusual. Then I started noticing a clicking noise. At first I thought it was the sound of the snowmobile cooling down, as engines expand and contract a lot in the cold, but the source of the sound was definitely not coming from that direction. My next thought was that there must be an animal nearby, in which case I needed to get out of there fast. You do not really want to mess with a wild animal. However, the clicking was far too regular for an animal to produce. It sounded mechanical, and again, the source was not coming from anywhere around me laterally. It was coming from above, so naturally I looked up, determined to figure out the origin of this strange noise. I saw what I always saw: stars, northern lights, a lazy satellite crossing the sky, all normal stuff. But just before I dismissed it altogether and started heading home, I noticed something strange in the aurora borealis. There were 3 unusually strong points of light. I ignored them at first, assuming they were oddly symmetrical stars, but that quickly proved false. They were definitely getting brighter. I kept staring in morbid fascination as they grew stronger and stronger, yet still remained single points in the sky. All the while, the clicking noise grew louder and more pronounced, shifting from something like a pen tapping on a desk to the sound of billiard balls clacking together inside my head. Then it stopped. The lights were gone, the clicking ceased, and aside from being a little stiff, cold, and thoroughly petrified, I was fine. I jumped back on the snowmobile, thinking maybe I was going crazy. The machine took a little longer than usual to start, and I began to worry, but soon it was running, and I headed back toward town. As I drove, several plausible explanations ran through my head. Maybe it had been a helicopter from the mine, or some strange aurora behavior. Probably not that big a deal. I pulled up to my house. The lights were all dark. Strange. It was not that late when I left. I opened the outer door as quietly as possible, removed my winter gear, and slipped through the inner door. The house was quiet. Really quiet. My parents are teachers and are usually up late marking or watching TV. All I was thinking was that I needed to get to bed without anyone noticing. That proved easy, and I was soon under my covers. I went to set my alarm for the next day, and suddenly everything made sense. The engine being hard to start, the stiffness, the cold, nobody being awake when I got home, after what felt like a relatively short period of time. It was almost 11 at night when I left, and now it was creeping up on 6 in the morning. I had stood there, staring at those clicking lights for almost 7 hours. I never ended up sleeping that night, and I do not go on late-night snowmobile rides anymore. Story 7. We used to live in a very old house that my dad's great-grandparents had raised their children in. Out of 9 kids, only 4 lived to adulthood. The others all died in the house, along with my great-grandfather. Needless to say, the place was incredibly creepy. We could never keep the blinds up in the upstairs window that faced east. My grandma said her dad used to stand at that window every morning, drinking his coffee and looking outside. One day, my mom and I were home alone and decided to do a little experiment. We went upstairs and closed all the curtains, then went outside to look at the windows from the yard. Every curtain was still closed except the one facing east. That curtain was open about 6 inches in the middle, just enough for someone to look out. I am not saying that house was haunted, but it definitely felt like it was. Story 8. A few years ago, my best friend and I moved into a rental house. It was definitely a strange place, and I immediately got a bad vibe from it. Every night when I went to sleep, I would hear music. Not singing, just music, like a distant radio playing. It wasn't any song I could ever recognize. I had the same kind of dream every night. There was a crowd of faceless people with a small boy standing in front of them. He never spoke, but I could tell he was trying to tell me something. The fridge would open on its own, and the cats would hiss at empty corners. Every day at 3 o'clock, we would smell cigarette smoke coming from the back room. My aunts, who are really into ghost hunting, set up cameras in the house one night. We didn't catch much, but one camera spun in circles for about 15 seconds. Then, at 3 in the morning, the front porch light turned on by itself, became extremely bright, and slowly faded out. When I moved out of the house after 2 years, I had trouble sleeping because I didn't have the music anymore. It was definitely a strange house. Story 9. I went to pick up my daughter from a dance on the waterfront. I was early, so I walked along the lake. I noticed something extremely bright in the sky, not moving, about 20 degrees up. Sirius was at roughly 40 degrees that night. I looked down and saw a pure white coyote walking along the water's edge. Even though I deliberately made a lot of noise so as not to startle it, the coyote never acknowledged my presence. I looked back at the star. It was still not moving, but suddenly it went from exceptionally bright to completely dim, then vanished. I looked back to where the coyote had been, and it was gone as well, though it was a very dark night. All of this happened at 12:30 in the morning. The next morning, I woke up to a phone call telling me my best friend had died in Norway. He died at 6:30 in the morning, local time, 12:30 in the morning, my time. Story 10. About 20 years ago, I was T-boned on the passenger side of my car by a drunk driver who ran a red light. I went flying across the intersection, and my car was stopped by slamming driver's side into a utility pole. I don't remember being hit. I only remember someone helping me out of the broken window. My car was absolutely totaled, and I did not have a scratch, bruise, or sore muscle to remember the accident by. When the police showed up, they did not believe that I was in the car crash, and had to rely on witnesses to attest to the fact they helped me out. I sometimes think I was somehow protected by something I don't understand, and that I was to go on to accomplish something major in my life. Then I get a little sad, because I don't really think I accomplished that. Story 11. My dad died in a motorcycle accident a few years ago, and after he passed away, strange things started happening when I returned to my dorm. The clock would fall off the wall and change time on its own, batteries would come loose from remotes, and loud bangs and knocks became fairly common. The strangest thing, though, happened when I was back home from college. I took a shower, got dressed, and went back into the bathroom to finish getting ready. As the steam on the mirror began to clear, I noticed faint smear marks forming what looked like lettering. I tilted the mirror, since it was one of those triple-pane medicine cabinet mirrors, and that is when I saw it. The word "Hey" was spelled out in his handwriting, along with the elvish symbol for I from the Lord of the Rings, the one my dad used to draw everywhere. This was probably more than 6 months after he passed away, and I have no idea how it got there. It had only been me and my mom in the house, and I know she would never do something like that. I even took a picture of it and will try to find it. The strangest part is that about a week earlier, I had cracked open a glow stick and it splashed onto the mirror. The writing was under the splashes and none of them were smeared or disturbed. To this day, I cannot explain how it happened. We actually ended up taking the entire mirror off the wall so it would not be ruined. Story 12. Not me, but my aunt. A woman who, to my knowledge, has never told me an untruth. Around Easter many years ago, our family was eagerly waiting for her grandma, my great-grandmother, to arrive and celebrate with us. She was supposed to come on Friday. Late Thursday night, after everyone had gone to bed, my aunt was awakened by a hand resting on her shoulder. She looked up and, to her surprise, saw her grandma smiling down at her. Grandma said she was very, very sorry she wouldn't be able to make it for Easter. She wished my aunt good night and said she was glad she got to see her before she went. My aunt didn't think much of it and went back to sleep. The next morning, the phone call came. Grandma had passed away in her sleep the night before. Story 13. My father passed away last year. One item he always said he wanted me to have was a shotgun, which had originally belonged to his grandfather. For years he had this shotgun stashed in the attic. After he passed, I had gone in the attic to look for it, only to find that it wasn't there. A few months later, I had a dream in which I was talking to him, and I asked him where he had put the shotgun. He told me it was in the closet of a spare bedroom. I called my mother and had her check, and sure enough, that's where it was. Now it's completely possible that my father had told me that when he was alive, and the dream was little more than a memory, but I certainly don't recall that being the case. Story 14. My mom always bought snow globes for my grandma. When my grandma passed away, my mom took them back to our house. My mom put them all up on the shelves that go around the entire living room. A few weeks had passed, and my mom found a video that she wanted. my brothers and I to watch because it reminded her of our grandma. We all sat down to watch it, and of course, near the end of the movie, our mom was crying. Right when the movie ends, all of the snow globes went off at the same time. The figurines didn't move on any of them, just the music. We all huddled together, of course, because we were scared as hell. And my mom suddenly said, "Mom?" And all of the music stopped, and the room became extremely cold. My mom suddenly felt really uncomfortable and had all of us run and get into the car, and she drove us to our godmother's house. She cried for hours until she got a call from our dad, saying he'd be home in a few minutes and should head back. When we all got back inside, it was warm again, but all of the snow globes were shattered on the ground, except for one, the one that was my grandma's favorite. Story 15. I posted this once before, but never got a good explanation about what could have caused it. When we lived in our last apartment, my wife swore there was a ghost in our kitchen. I never saw anything personally, but she says she felt its presence. I had one, and only one strange experience in the 4 years we lived in that place. One day I was sitting in the living room playing some Xbox when all of a sudden the controller died. I thought it was weird because I had recently changed the batteries. I grabbed the other spare controller, and that one was dead too. I grabbed the receiver remote to turn down the volume, and that remote was dead too. Same with the TV and Fios remotes. I grabbed my laptop, which I had recently charged, and it was also dead. So I grabbed my cell phone to text my wife that something weird had happened. It was also totally discharged. Naturally, my wife blamed the kitchen ghost. I'm more skeptical than that, but I've never heard a better explanation for the simultaneous power drain in all my battery-powered devices. So I'm willing to chalk it up to a paranormal experience. The last time I posted this, someone said it could have been an EMP, but wouldn't that have disabled all electronics rather than just draining batteries? Story 16. My mom grew up in a rural part of Guatemala where witchcraft was taken very seriously, and she has countless stories about strange things she and her brothers and sisters experienced there. Of all of them, this one has always been the creepiest to me. There was a young apprentice to a witch doctor who traveled around the country healing people. He was murdered west of Guatemala City, and arrangements were made to bring his body back home for burial. To save money, they paid very little to have a man pick up the body and transport it back in his pickup truck. The man loaded the coffin onto his truck and began the drive back, but along the way, his truck broke down. Alone in the dark hours of the early morning, he frantically tried to get it running again, knowing he needed to return in time for the services. Out of nowhere, a man dressed in a nice suit appeared and helped him fix the truck. Once it was running, the man simply walked back down the road and disappeared into the darkness. The driver made it back in time, and after preparations, the services began. When he walked past the open coffin to pay his respects, he froze. The man lying in the coffin was the very same man who had helped him to fix his truck. To this day, I get shivers thinking about it. Story 17. My grandfather passed away just a few weeks after I was born. Never met the guy, never knew what he looked like. When I was 5 years old, I started to see this man in our rocking chair. I called him the rocking chairman. My parents thought it was that imaginary friend stage, but it started to bug them when I told them every single day. They finally questioned me about it. I told them every detail I could remember, and finally they showed me a picture of a man. It was my grandfather. To this day, I'm 22 now. Every time I dream, he is in the background, somewhere. I remember when I dreamed about my high school graduation, and I looked in the stands and I saw him with my parents. I like to think that he's just watching out for me and being there when he's not really there. So I am a true believer of the paranormal. Story 18. I attended the same university for both my bachelor's and my PhD. There was a wonderful woman named Jennifer who taught my reading in the content area class. All the guys swooned over her. She was stunning. But I loved her because she read The Giver aloud to us. She was an amazing instructor and was pursuing her PhD in literacy at the time. A few years later, Jennifer had moved to South Carolina to teach literacy. I was now in my PhD program, working in the same graduate student office she had once occupied, alongside other literacy colleagues of hers. Then, we got the devastating news that she had been murdered by her boyfriend. The entire department was crushed. She was genuinely loved by everyone who knew. Her and her loss hit us all incredibly hard. A few days after her funeral, after her body was brought home, I was in the office suite at school very early in the morning when no one else was around. The graduate students shared a fishbowl-style office, 10 of us at group desks, inside a larger office suite that was locked and controlled by motion-activated lights. As I was walking in, I passed a locked door with windows and saw a woman with short dark hair walking the other way inside. That alone was strange. But what really stood out was that the lights didn't flicker on when she moved. I walked around the corner to the door with the key code and let myself in. As soon as I entered, the lights turned on. I went to the area where I had seen her, but no one was there. It was just me and an entire suite of empty offices. I swear it was her, saying goodbye to a place where she had spent so many years and made so many friends. It scared me, but it made me sad too. Story 19 I saw. A low-flying triangular craft that looked exactly like this in northern MN. It hovered above a parking lot for a minute or so, then slowly slid out of sight. It was very large, and roughly 100-200 feet above ground. I researched similar sightings, which are numerous, and there are some theories, but nothing concrete. Notably, this happened about 20 miles from a U.S. Air Force base. Thankfully, I was with one other person who witnessed this. Story 20. I never believed in paranormal stuff, and still do not. But about 3 years ago, something happened to my wife and me that we still cannot explain. Since I was a teenager, I have had trouble waking up in the morning. Maybe my sleep schedule is off, or maybe I am just a very deep sleeper. Either way, waking me up takes real effort. One Christmas, my grandmother gave me a radio alarm clock because I kept sleeping through the ringing alarm. She also gave me a piece of advice. If you really need to wake up, turn the dial all the way to the far left to pick up a radio station and set the volume all the way up. This is what I did on all important occasions, and it worked like a charm. There was no way I could sleep through the whispering, irritating static at full volume. Unfortunately, my grandmother passed away a few years later. Fast forward to about 3 years ago. It had been a hard week for both my wife and me, and we were sound asleep on a Friday night when, suddenly, the radio alarm went off in the middle of the night. It did not wake me, but it woke my wife because she could not make it stop. The alarm was set to off, yet it kept playing. I tried everything, and after about 10 minutes, I somehow managed to make it stop. We went back to sleep, but after about 15 minutes, the radio started playing again. I must have hit the snooze button. There was no way to shut it up, so I cursed, pulled the plug, and went back to sleep. My wife and I almost jumped out of bed when the alarm went off again. Screeching with yelling, whistling static at full volume. It is hard to describe the feeling, somewhere between panic, confusion, and pure adrenaline. I knew I had pulled the plug. I had seen it myself. No lights were blinking, no clock display, just a dead black radio alarm. My wife panicked and ran out of the room while I stood there staring at the alarm, frozen in place, unable to do anything but feel afraid. Then, all of a sudden, it went quiet. In the silence, I heard the muffled sound of our telephone, barely audible from the living room. I went to find it and discovered it wedged between the couch and a large pillow. The number calling was my mother's. It turned out that my mother had been home alone when she fell on her way back from the bathroom to her bedroom and broke her hip. Unable to move, she lay there helpless, desperately trying to call someone for help with her mobile phone, which had been in her bathrobe. Had the radio alarm not woken us up, we would have gone. On a weekend trip the next morning, this is the creepiest, most paranormal thing I have ever experienced. Story 21. I lived in an old farmhouse that was provided by my work. The stairs were especially creepy. One night, I was home alone in my room when I heard someone open the door to the stairwell, walk up the stairs, and stop right outside my door. I opened the door, but no one was there, even though I had heard it very clearly. That was not the only time it happened. On another occasion, I heard someone going up and down the stairs. I turned on the lights, and the noise stopped immediately. When I turned the lights back off and went to lie down in my room, it started again. This has happened a few times. Story 22. My mom told me this story the other day, and it freaked me the hell out. When my oldest sister was little, like 3, she asked my then pregnant aunt to pick her up to hold her. My mom said she was like, "She can't pick you up, honey. She has a baby in her tummy." And then my little sister was like, "That baby is dead." My mom freaked out, but my aunt and grandma were fine, and were telling my mom it was all good. She was just a toddler and didn't know what she was saying. Well, lo and behold, my aunt goes to the doctor the next day for a routine pregnancy checkup, and the baby was no more. Gives me the willies just thinking about it. Story 23. I have memories that are very early, and most of them are scary, but I had one thing. When I was very young, I am talking between age 2 and 3, I used to see this man who looked just like my dad when he holds his cheeks to make this goofy face. Kinda like this, but a 40-year-old man. Only the dude's face was like that, without even holding it. I recall playing Legos with my brother in our room, and the guy walking by the window, turning slowly to look in, bulging eyes, and starts yelling. I would sit on the floor frozen in fear. My brother didn't see these things. And now that I think of it, this man I saw was never directly in front of me. I only saw him through windows. I am pretty sure I was one of those kids who hallucinated when they were very young. Story 24. When I was about 5, my mom and I used to play a game together. She would sit on the step by the back door of our house, and I would ride my tricycle in a circle and pretend to grab a gem from her. I called the game Volcano because I imagined I was riding around the edge of a volcano collecting precious gems. One day, while we were playing, a woman pulled into the driveway. She was completely white, pale as if covered in flour, and she was wearing a white dress that looked Victorian, with lots of lace and a full puffy skirt. She was also holding a sun umbrella, closed by the handle. She walked up to the edge of the carport, and I rode my tricycle over to meet her. I stopped and looked up at her, and she looked down at me. After a minute or so, she turned and left. I went back to my mom and asked her who the lady was. She said, "Who?" I told her, "The lady that was just here." But my mom had no idea what I was talking about. As far as she knew, it had just been the two of us the entire time. Not very spooky, but pretty friggin' weird. One time during a storm, I was looking out my window and saw a power line fall down, sparks and all. Then I watched it rise back up and reconnect, as if the whole thing were playing in reverse. Another time, I was in my room at night drying my hair when I heard music coming from outside my window. I remember thinking my neighbors must be having a party. The music kept playing, so I finally looked outside to see what was going on, but there was nothing there. No people, no party, nothing at all. It is worth noting that no electronics were on in my house at the time, and I was the only one home. The voice I heard was a man singing the words, "Pack your bags." I do not know why, but it really unsettled me. Story 25, I saw a UFO once. I grew up, a really small town with a population of around 500. There was nothing there besides cornfields and empty land, and it sat between a larger city and an Air Force base. One night, I was inside playing my NES when my mother came rushing up the porch and into the house, screaming that a UFO had followed her all the way home. Naturally, my dad and I laughed at first, until we saw the look on her face. Then we bolted outside. What we saw can only be described as a very round, smooth version of a B-2 bomber. It had a creepy metallic, shiny color. It was nearly invisible unless you were directly underneath it, and it reflected a huge field of view from the ground lights bouncing off its surface. I was probably around 10 years old at the time, so my memory and sense of distance could be off, but as I recall, the aircraft was almost completely silent and moving at around 40 miles per hour. I know aircraft cannot maintain lift at that speed, but my father and I followed it in a car for as long as we could, until we literally ran out of road, and we were easily able to keep pace with it. From what I remember, the design clearly looked like a newer version of an already existing US military aircraft, but it was still freaky as hell. Story 26. This may sound fake, but what I'm about to say is completely true. When my mother was young, she was very sick and needed medicine. Not everyone in the area we lived in liked Native Americans, which we are, so she relied on a local medicine man for treatment. Years later, it was discovered that the medicine was no longer helping because she was not actually sick. She believed she was being haunted. She remembers seeing a demonic figure when she was very young, though at the time, she did not know whether it was real or imagined. These experiences happened from her earliest memories until she was about 5 years old. Then, 30 years later, that same demonic figure began appearing again. I know she was not just imagining it, because I could see it, hear it, and sometimes even feel something, like a sign of its presence. She started having nightmares, and we all knew something was wrong. We decided to move back to our reserve to see if the problem was the house itself, but it was not. No matter where she went, this thing followed her, and it followed us too. I will be honest, for a long time, I thought she might be exaggerating or faking it until one night. My mom tried to cope with the haunting by drinking tea and coloring. That night, she was sitting in the living room doing just that, and nothing seemed out of the ordinary, so none of us expected anything to happen. Suddenly, we heard screaming coming from the living room, and we all ran in to see what was wrong. She was crying and yelling that something was scratching her back. I did not believe her at first, until I lifted the back of her shirt and saw it myself. Marks were appearing on her skin, as if she were being scratched. The scratches were not just already there. As I watched, new scratch marks kept appearing, long and red, over and over again. I was terrified. I ran to grab some sweetgrass, and while I was across the house, I heard the door open. It turned out my mom was walking toward the lake. It was the middle of a Canadian winter, around minus 35 degrees, and she went outside barefoot, wearing nothing but her pajamas. Afterward, she did not remember any of it, and to this day she has no memory of that night. I remember everything. Now we are afraid it may be starting again. She has been having brutal nightmares, and other members of the family are starting to see black shadow figures. Another terrifying sign of this. We have a cat, and from time to time we notice it staring at a fixed point, as if it is looking at someone or something. Then it suddenly runs away, like it is scared. I swear I had pictures on my camera, but they seem to be deleted. I will try to look around and see if I can find them. Story 27. When I was 7, I was having a sleepover at my cousin's house. We played with Barbies in a big Barbie RV. I woke up in the middle of the night and saw an old woman in a dress or nightgown walk straight through the Barbie RV and then through the door into the garage. I never told anyone about it. 10 years later, my aunt and uncle were selling that same house. My dad said, finally they can get rid of that haunted house with the annoying old lady. I asked him what he meant, and he described the ghost he believed was there. It was exactly what I remembered seeing when I was 7. I had never told them my story, yet they described the same thing. I'm a skeptic, but this is the one experience that makes me question that. Story 28. I lost my grandfather several years ago. He was the first of my grandparents to die, and the rest sort of fell like dominoes behind him. I was out of town when he passed. He had been in the hospital a while, stable, so it was very unexpected. My father called me early in the morning and told me, "Come home, Papa's gone." I drove home a complete mess, wiped tears away and stood strong for my dad, helped with the arrangements, supported everyone as best I could. Not long after, my grandmother's Alzheimer's got much worse, and she followed him into death. The night before she died, she looked at the ceiling and smiled so big, saying, "Jesus and grandfather's name, they're here for me." She passed quietly with family present, and then the rest of us were called in to mourn and assemble as a family, all that passed without incident. A couple of years later, my maternal great-grandmother, a true diamond, fell and broke her hip. She was closing in on 100 and ultimately made up her mind to just let go. We understood and took turns sitting with her until it was time. The last time I saw her, she told me that she was ready to go and imparted her last words on me. I leaned into her with a hug and asked her for a favor. "When you get home, will you tell Papa I'm sorry I wasn't there?" She just smiled, nodded, and winked at me. We cried a little, and I went home. She passed that night at about 3 in the morning. Fast forward to a little over a year or so. The email I sent my parents telling them about this is dated 2/19/12. There is a local convention here that normally has ghost hunter panels and the like. This year, a former TAPS team member and some other ghost hunter types held a campfire stories sort of panel, with people contributing their own stories, much like this thread. I sat there listening. It was all pretty neat. The panel was uneventful. It ended, and I lingered around for a while. I was chatting with one of them, who gave me a copy of their book as people milled about leaving. And a heavyset guy who had been sitting on the panel earlier came up to me and said, "I need to tell you something. I was going to leave, but I can't until I tell you this. I hope it doesn't freak you out." So I told him to go ahead, and he looked at me and said, "There is an older gentleman behind you, tall and thin, white button-down shirt, khaki slacks, glasses, a little bit of stubble, very strong jaw. He's been with you since you came in here, and he wants me to tell you it's okay. He is very insistent and really wanted me to tell you. He wanted you to know it was okay." I pulled a photo of him and my grandmother, at a younger age, but still very much themselves, out of my wallet and asked him if that's who he saw. He went white, looked over my shoulder and back to the photo and said, "Yes." Holy friggin' crap. Onions everywhere. He told me that my grandfather was around me often and protected me. And now, I swear that's whose handprint was on my shoulder. Story 29, I was hitchhiking across the country. One night, I was trying to get out of Colorado. Long story. And the weather was terrible. It was cold, wet, and I had not seen a car for at least half an hour. The rain was coming down so hard that I could only see a few feet ahead of me. Out of nowhere, a car pulled over beside me. I jumped in and turned to thank the driver, only to realize there was no one in the driver's seat at all. Then the car started moving, very slowly. There was a curve ahead, and I was sure it was going to go off the edge of a cliff. I was in full-on panic mode and couldn't move. I nearly lost it entirely. Just before the car hit the safety rail, a hand suddenly appeared from the window and turned the wheel. This happened a few more times before I finally got my wits about me and took the chance to escape. I booked it, adrenaline pumping, and before I knew it, I had made it to a gas station on the edge of a tiny town. I was soaking wet and completely freaked out. I started telling the guy at the gas station what had just happened. He hooked me up with some hot coffee, and we ended up swapping stories for a little while. That is when, through the haze of the rainstorm, I saw 3 guys walk up to the cashier. One of them said to the others, "Look, it's the weirdo that jumped in the car while we were pushing it." About a year later, I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of a lawnmower. I looked out the window and saw nothing, so I assumed I was imagining it or half dreaming. The next morning, the lawn was mowed in random, aimless paths. Story 30. I used to do the ghost hunting thing with friends back in high school. One of the many times we visited a particular haunted spot, a bridge with a Civil War era hanging story. This one friend of ours started acting weird, talking about bad spirits this and evil that. His speech pattern alternated between unintelligible muttering under his breath and unusually angry, which wasn't characteristic of him. Drugs or alcohol were not involved. Ultimately, he started yelling, banging his head against the steering wheel, then ended up fainting in someone's lawn. We all thought he was faking the whole thing to freak out some of the more open-minded people we had along with us. But he didn't respond to a sternum rub. Paramedics were called. He woke up shortly after they arrived, claims to not remember anything after visiting that bridge. I am the last person to believe in bad spirits. Edit, nowadays anyway. And I imagine that a psychiatrist might be able to explain these events straight away. The only thing that sticks with me is that this guy was not known to have a history of this kind of behavior, and Afaik has not since. And I've never seen dedication to a prank last through a sternum rub. Story 31. I am probably late to this thread, but I witnessed something very strange while I was living in Africa. I used to live in Zimbabwe until I was about 9 years old, and one day at school, we had gym class outside. It was a normal swimming lesson, and nothing out of the usual happened. It was pretty much an average swimming class. After the class was over, I spent a while longer in the showers, and for whatever reason, I was the last person to leave the pool area. On my way out, I saw a couple of things fly past me at a fast speed. At first glance, I thought it was just a pair of dragonflies playing around in the air. They flew back towards me, and I noticed that they were considerably larger than a normal dragonfly. What I saw, and I swear on my life, was 2 lizard-like creatures with dragonfly wings, about the size of a dove or a medium-sized bird. They flew around the pool for a couple of minutes, playing with each other in the air, and then suddenly they flew off and were gone. I drew pictures of the creatures, showed them to teachers, parents, and an uncle who was a biologist. Nobody had seen or heard of these creatures, and nobody believed me. I still wonder what kind of creatures they were. Story 32. My granddad told me the other day about his supernatural encounter. He said that he had a friend who he had known for around 35 years and worked with for over 20 of those years. When this happened, about 2 years ago, the friend had died a short while previous to the encounter. My granddad stated that he woke up in the middle of the night and saw him standing at the end of his bed, dressed in a fancy suit. My granddad told me that if he could describe how he looked in a word, it would be dapper, and that this was how my granddad remembered him dressing as a young man when they would go out partying together. My granddad didn't feel at all scared, but actually very calm and happy instead. My granddad's friend smiled at him, and my granddad smiled back, and then he vanished. Not in a Hollywood fade-out waving kind of vanish, but a blink and he is gone vanish. My granddad is aware that it could very easily be his mind playing tricks on him, but that didn't stop him having a big smile on his face when he was remembering the story and his friend while telling me about him. Story 33, I posted this a while back on a similar thread. It relates to a creepy old Ouija board my parents found in the attic of the house I lived in as a kid. When we moved into the house, there was a ton of old crap left in the attic by the former, very old occupants. One of the many items left behind was a very, very old-looking Ouija board, made out of wood and lined with what I always assumed was velvet. My mom was creeped out by it and told my dad, throw it away. My dad disposed of it by throwing it into the fireplace, which had a pretty good fire going at the time. Within about 20 seconds, the fire exploded, shattering the highly heat-resistant glass doors covering the fireplace, and thick black smoke billowed into the house, even though the flue remained open. Super creepy. Someone explained that the board likely had air pockets in it, and/or the paint on it was an accelerant of some kind. It also could have had nothing to do with the board, and just been a coincidence. we usually put into the fire old. Logs that had been sitting outside for some time. Still creepy. Story 34. Nothing particularly crazy, but as a non-believer, this actually stopped me in my tracks and made me raise an eyebrow. When I was in high school, my grandma passed away unexpectedly. In the week following her death, we were at my grandfather's place while my mother and aunts were cleaning out her belongings to make things easier on him. On her bed, my mother had laid out various trinkets they did not know what to do with and were planning to throw away. She told me to take whatever I wanted. I noticed a small llama statuette that my grandmother had bought during a trip to Peru many years earlier, so I took it. I kept the llama on my dresser as a memento. At the time, I worked at a grocery store as a produce clerk. We had the earliest shifts in the store, 6 o'clock if I remember correctly, and being a high schooler, it was really difficult to wake up that early in the morning. One weekend, my alarm didn't go off, and I woke up just 5 minutes before my shift. It was a particularly dry winter, and working in produce, going in and out of the cooler constantly, made your skin and lips dry and prone to cracking. As I was rushing to get ready, I couldn't find my chapstick. I was hurrying back and forth between the washroom and my room, looking for it, and just as I was about to give up, I heard a loud bang! Startled, I went to investigate, and noticed my llama was no longer on the dresser. I went to pick it up, and there it was, fallen right next to my chapstick. Without thinking, I muttered, "Thanks, Grandma." That's when it hit me. Oh crap. What the hell? And then I left for work. Story 35. The creepiest thing that has ever happened to me was during my senior year of high school. At the time, my siblings and I could barely stand being in the same room, and things were just as bad with my mom. Everyone was always arguing, and my brothers and I were constantly getting into fistfights. One night, I came home and was walking to my room in the dark. Earlier that day, I had cleaned out my binder and left all the papers scattered on my floor because I was running late for practice. My room was on the opposite side of the house from everyone else's, right next to the garage. I have a row of 4 windows in my room, and when my neighbors had their backlight on, I could see the silhouettes of everything inside. Because of how the windows were positioned, I never got a breeze in my room, and that night, they were closed. I was walking down the hallway toward my room in the dark, around 10 at night, when I heard the papers moving. It sounded like something was walking across them. I was looking down at the floor at first, but then I looked up to see what was happening. I saw some kind of black shape crawling across my floor. Its legs were stretched out unnaturally long, and it looked like it had rough, scaly skin. I stopped dead in my tracks, and then it looked up at me. I ran straight to my mom's room and slept there that night. The next day I told her what I had seen. She is not the skeptical type, so she believed me and blessed the house with holy water that same day. Little by little, things started to change for the better. I later found out she had even put some holy water in our drinking water. Honestly, I had always been extremely skeptical, but that experience changed that. Story 36. I once saw a fleet of UFOs with my wife. One passed directly over our car while we were on the highway. It was so close that it should have been deafening, yet when we rolled down the window, we could not hear a thing. It was triangular in shape, with 3 round purple lights on its underside. When we got home, I saw more of them. I ran down the street to catch a better look, as one of them was leaving from my vantage point. The lights behind it kept morphing and changing, and it appeared to be at least 4 stories tall. It was one of the strangest sights I have ever seen, and I will never forget it. Story 37. About 10 years ago, I was walking one night with my sister. We were passing a familiar point on the road when suddenly we both found ourselves about 200 meters back the way we had just come, approaching the familiar point for the second time. She turned to me and said, "What just happened?" We both experienced exactly the same thing, like we had just been pulled back 20 seconds in time, and neither of us could explain it. No spooky ghosts, but a lasting feeling of something deeply unnatural having happened. Story 38. This happened to my parents. We were at home and it was nighttime, so my brothers and I had already gone to sleep. My parents had apparently decided to rent a movie and watch it while we had been asleep. While they had been watching the movie, suddenly the volume turned up to full when neither of them had the remote. They grabbed the remote to try and turn it back down, to no avail. This was considering we had stereo sound speakers connected for, a better experience. As they were trying to turn it down, a booming deep laughter came from the speakers. The scene did not have anyone laughing. Apparently the voice just laughed diabolically for what seemed to them a minute. And then without warning, the volume went all the way down and the laughing stopped. Apparently that night, my mom unplugged the speakers and stored them away in a storage room in the back. My brothers and I didn't notice them gone, since we had only had them for a couple days, until we were in our current home when we were barely moving in. We found the speakers in some box, and we asked my mom, how come we never use these for TV and stuff? She then told us the story I just recounted and explained to us how she thought it was maybe the speakers being haunted by some demon. It kind of freaked my brothers and I out, but we now use them all the time with no problem. At least, not yet. Story 39. When I was 8 years old, my best friend and I were sitting next to each other at lunch and just talking about 8-year-old things. He said, I had a dream last night that 2 planes hit these giant skyscrapers and there was smoke and everything. I was watching from the torch thing on the Statue of Liberty. That's not exactly what he said, but those were the main points. Our teacher, sitting nearby and overhearing him, identified what he had seen in his dream as the Statue of Liberty. I remember we had a fun time figuring it out and pretending to guess what it meant. The next day, terrorists hit the World Trade Centers. I will never forget the look my 3rd grade teacher gave my friend and me. It was the purest confusion and fear I have ever seen. Story 40. 2 years ago, my roommate and I were in our dorm room when we woke up around 4 a.m. after her blow dryer suddenly fell off her dresser. We turned on the lights and noticed that all the magnets had come off our fridge and were scattered on the floor. We were definitely spooked, but we eventually went back to sleep. The next day, while we were both in the room, the TV randomly turned on even though the remote was lying on the ground. About an hour later, our entire room lost power. No one else on the floor did. The power wasn't restored until the next day. Story 51. I have had several experiences in my life that have made me deeply interested in the paranormal. This one is my favorite. Last year, my very close friend and roommate passed away. It was easily the most difficult thing I have had to live through so far. A couple of months later, on what would have been her birthday, an alarm clock that had been unplugged and sitting on a shelf in the closet suddenly started going off and woke me up. It had not been used in years. It had no power source, and no alarm had been set. I told myself it was probably just a fluke, but the idea that maybe Megan was saying hello was hard to ignore. Later, that day when I got into my car, my iPod, which was on shuffle, started skipping songs on its own. I was upset thinking something was wrong with it. It skipped a couple dozen songs and then stopped on her favorite one, a song she even had lyrics from tattooed on her foot. After that, I knew it was Megan, just saying hello to me on her birthday. It was the most comforting experience I have ever had. Story 52. I saw a very distinctive, creepy creature enter and leave my room. I was 7 years old and shared a room with my sister. It was about 1 a.m. and I could not sleep, so I was just staring at the wall. That is when I noticed something moving near the door. Someone was coming in very slowly. Because it was dark, it took a moment for me to realize what I was seeing. It was a woman wearing a large pointy hat. At first, I thought it might be my cousin who lived with us, but she was not that short. The only way it could have been her was if she were walking on her knees. When I looked down to check, I realized she was not touching the floor at all. I could tell she had the face of an old woman, but it was definitely not a human face. Her eyes were far too large, and her expression was completely blank. She moved very slowly toward my sister, who was sleeping, and I stayed perfectly still. She reached my sister's bed and just stood there, looking down at her. Then I moved slightly and made a sound. Instantly, the figure turned her head toward me. Her huge eyes locked onto mine for a moment, and then she rushed out of the room, almost flying, incredibly fast. After that, I pulled the blanket over myself and stayed there. The next day, I told my parents, but they did not believe me. A small woman with a pointy hat, a floating dress, and huge eyes sounded too strange to take seriously. Years later, I started wondering if I had been dreaming or imagining it after all. Fast forward 4 years, and there was a news story about a police officer who had been attacked by a witch in a city about 3 hours away from where I lived. He said he saw something floating down from the sky and landing on the roof of his patrol car. It then tried to get in through the window, scratching and pulling at him, until he eventually passed out. In the interview, he described it as being dressed in black, with big eyes, dark skin, and a pointy hat. He said it was flying on its own. The news showed the composite drawings made from his description, and it was exactly what I had seen. There were also reports from another officer in 2010 with matching descriptions. He mentioned that it moved with superhuman speed. After the story aired, a lot of people started faking related sightings since the news gained attention. This happened in Mexico, by the way. After seeing the report, I could not sleep well for about a week. I will admit, I even slept in my parents' room a couple of times. For reference, it looked somewhat like the Flatwoods Monster. This is 100% real, by the way. I am really skeptic about things like this. But after this experience, man, there are things out there that truly have no explanation. Story 53, I was at my girlfriend's house, and she has 2 cats. One of them is a big fat cat, black, named Taz. He's a pretty creepy cat. I'll often catch him staring at me from under a desk or from the shadows. I was talking to my girlfriend in the kitchen when I saw a man in my peripheral. I turned to look, but it was just Taz. I continued talking and saw a man again, much more clearly, but still like a shade, in my peripheral again. My girlfriend told me previously she's sensitive to spirits and stuff, and while not strictly believing in such things, I'd humor her. This time though, after seeing this man's shape over Taz, I asked her if she saw him too. She told me she did, that it was her uncle who gave her Taz. She preferred not to acknowledge him because she hated him. Since then, I have stopped seeing him, but Taz is still really creepy. There are a bunch of other stories of crazy things happening. Story 54. This isn't paranormal, but it is definitely a mystery yet to be solved. My sister, who just moved into a new apartment, recently received a plain envelope in the mail that was addressed to her. Inside the envelope was a newspaper clipping regarding getting approved for a car loan. On the clipping was a post-it note that said her name, and then said, "I've been approved." It was signed by Jay. The strange part is that she hasn't given her address to anyone. No one in my family even has her new address because her mailbox door is broken off and she just gets her mail delivered to my parents' house. So that, by itself, is super weird. But this is where it gets even stranger. As she was telling my parents, my mom looked at my dad with a weird face and then told us that they received a plain envelope addressed to them with a newspaper clipping inside about retiring, and a post-it note signed J about 2 years ago. We have no idea who this could be. They all noticed on the envelope, by stamp, that it was sent from around our area. None of our extended family lives in our area, or even nearby, and we aren't even particularly close with our extended family. Who is Jay? Story 55. I actually shared my room with a ghost for about 3 years. I know it sounds crazy, but it really happened. I saw him a couple of times, and at the beginning it genuinely scared me. I refused to move out though, and stayed there every night. No one else in the house, including the dogs, would go down to my room. I had a few girls over, and the ghost seemed to get jealous. He would pull their hair and poke them while they were asleep. Yes, it was a he. His name was Eduardo, and everyone called him Ito when he was alive. He didn't die in my house, but his grandma did. He had gone through something traumatic a long time ago in my room. Over time, we actually became friends, if I had to put a label on it. I've been away from that house for 2 years now. I don't miss him, but I really hope he isn't being an a-hole to someone else the way he was to me at the beginning. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an update.